Hey, welcome back to Crossroads. Wall Street cash may be helping the CCP in its latest economic plan, but Trump has other ideas. I'll be talking about this and more, so stay tuned. Donald Trump Jr. wrote on Twitter, quote, audio evidence of Hunter Biden admitting to being in a partnership with the, quote, spy chief of China, and he admits his father knew.
My best friend in business, Devin, has named me as a witness without telling me in a criminal case, and my father without telling me.
Amid heavy controversy from Democrats, Amy Coney Barrett has been sworn into the U.S. Supreme Court, replacing the vacant seat left by the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Also, the CCP is looking to revive Hong Kong's status on the global economic stage, and Wall Street has begun pouring money into a new IPO for this purpose. I'll be explaining this. And also, I'll be interviewing James Carafano about Trump and Biden's defense policies, so stay tuned for that. Hey, welcome back, everyone. First off, Amy Coney Barrett was sworn into the U.S. Supreme Court on October 26th, about an hour after she was confirmed for the position in a 52-48 vote by the Senate. Now, during the ceremony, President Donald Trump commented on her dedication to the U.S. Constitution.
This is a momentous day for America, for the United States Constitution, and for the fair and impartial rule of law.
Barrett suggested during the ceremony that she would remain independent of partisan politics and said that there's a separation of duties that makes the judiciary distinct from other government branches.
The oath that I have solemnly taken tonight means at its core that I will do my job without any fear or favor, and that I will do so independently of both the political branches and of my own preferences.
In other news, Donald Trump Jr. wrote on Twitter, quote, audio evidence of Hunter Biden admitting to being in a partnership with the, quote, spy chief of China, and he admits his father knew. He's questioning whether the media will be covering these new tapes released of Hunter Biden speaking about this alleged deal and noting his father's involvement of it, that being Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. We can listen to the audio recording of this now.
I get calls from my father to tell me that the New York Times is calling, but my old partner Eric, who literally has done me harm for I don't know how long, is the one taking the calls because my father will not stop sending the calls to Eric. I have another New York Times reporter calling about my representation of literally, Dr. Patrick Coe, the f***ing spy chief of China, who started the company that my partner, who was worth $323 billion, founded, and is now missing. The richest man in the world is missing, who was my partner. He was missing since I last saw him in his $58 million apartment and signed a $4 billion deal to build the largest LNG port in the world. And I am receiving calls from the Southern District of New York, from the U.S. Attorney himself. My best friend in business, Devin, has named me as a witness without telling me in a criminal case, and my father without telling me.
Meanwhile, in China, the Chinese Communist Party is reporting a 44-year low in economic growth, and Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam visited Beijing to discuss how Hong Kong could be used to help the Chinese regime revive its economy and push back against sanctions. And as this happens, 4 Wall Street banks are sponsoring the IPO of China's Ant Group, part of this whole plan, which may be the largest IPO in history, and which funnels money to the CCP through Hong Kong. Now, Carrie Lam alleged in a press conference ahead of her visit that there are many global campaigns against Hong Kong. She pointed to the 12 activists who recently fled Hong Kong for Taiwan and who were intercepted by CCP authorities and brought to China under charges they helped anti-government protests because they participated in the democracy protests. Now, Carrie Lam said, quote, they have been suspected of breaching serious crimes in Hong Kong, Instead of staying behind and accept legal responsibility by going through the legal system, which is an independent judiciary, they have chosen to flee Hong Kong. Now, Carrie Lam is planning to spend 3 days in Beijing and 5 days in Shenzhen and Guangzhou for the talks on the role Hong Kong will play in the Chinese regime's new economic plans. She said that, quote, "We need more support measures from the mainland of China, especially in light of the overall direction that Hong Kong should move to better integrate with the mainland." And as the CCP looks to rebuild its economy after losing its special trade status in Hong Kong, and amid various sanctions and other problems, Wall Street in the U.S. is pouring money into China. The Daily Torch questioned in a recent headline, quote, "Why are Wall Street banks funneling $40 billion into the Chinese Communist Party via the Ant Group IPO?" Now, Citigroup Inc., JP Morgan Chase & Co., and Morgan Stanley are underwriting the IPO for Ant Group, which can be valued between $35 billion and $40 billion in Shanghai and in Hong Kong. Now, Jack Ma, retired chairman of Alibaba, is the controlling shareholder of Ant Group, and Alibaba holds a non-controlling stake. As Daily Torch reports, the move by prominent U.S. banks, particularly to underwrite the IPO in Hong Kong, also legitimizes China's takeover of Hong Kong. It notes this, quote, "calls into question why Wall Street is now expanding its operations in favor of the CCP." And it also questioned, quote, "Why are these investment banks supporting the crackdown of human rights in Hong Kong?" This move would undermine the Trump administration's sanctions against the CCP, particularly in Hong Kong. It would also help the CCP revitalize its plans for a high-tech economic model to compete with the United States. Yet the move may also be blocked. Now, Reuters reports in an exclusive story on October 14th that the Trump administration is considering adding China's Ant Group to its trade blacklist before the firm can go public. This will add Ant Group to the U.S. entity list, which would restrict U.S. companies from doing business with it. Now, Ant Group is the parent company of China's largest digital payment platform, Alipay, which is similar to a Chinese version of PayPal with about 1.2 billion users. The fintech company is aiming for a valuation of around $225 billion through its public offering. It was already raising concerns about its technologies being used by the CCP for programs to suppress the Chinese people. Now, the Committee on the Present Danger China, a Washington-based advocacy organization, issued open letters to the leaders of Hong Kong Stock Exchange and 4 Wall Street banks, warning of this new offering. It states that the committee identified 7 categories of material risk with Ant Group around national security, human rights, and other issues. The letter warns of, quote, Ant Group's role in oppressing the Chinese people and those of the PRC, People's Republic of China's, captive nations. Its support for the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, and its theft of private and proprietary information. The company should properly be placed on the Commerce Department's entity list as soon as possible. It notes also that through this IPO, the Chinese Communist Party is hoping to bring in American investment in a bid to, quote, continue to have access to Western financing. It notes that in turn, the investments would, quote, eviscerate bipartisan Hong Kong autonomy territory. Now, folks, the Chinese Communist Party is not doing well economically. They had the virus situation, a lot of people out of work, a lot of factories closing. They had different companies pull out of China because of national security concerns or other concerns. Many companies are leaving China. Japan and India, again, are paying them to leave China. The U.S. is looking for domestic manufacturing and domestic innovation, protecting that from the Chinese Communist Party. Many countries in the world, the new trend is pulling out of China. But as different companies are pulling manufacturing out of China, Wall Street and investors are pouring money into China. And with this as well, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to revitalize these plans using Western finances. This plan the CCP is working on is part of this. Meanwhile, the Chinese regime is pushing back against U.S. sanctions with its own sanctions on the United States. After the U.S. renewed programs to supply weapons to Taiwan, the CCP is responding by placing sanctions on U.S. military contractors, including Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others. Now, with that said, would the Chinese regime's sanctions do anything to the United States? Very unlikely, and here's why. First off, these only target the military branches, the arms manufacturing branches of these companies. So China, for example, doing business with Boeing to buy things like, for example, planes and other parts and so on, will not affect that. And so the Chinese regime already not being able to buy a lot of U.S. military equipment really can't do much with this. And on top of that as well, one of the reasons why U.S. sanctions cut so deeply is because of the U.S. influence over the global financial markets. The U.S. dollar is the main basis of international trade. And so U.S. sanctions, being with the U.S. dollar, impact that. The Chinese Communist Party does not have that same level of influence. In other words, these are basically symbolic sanctions. They will have no real weight. It does not affect any country outside of China for the most part, and it will not affect sales to China with these companies either. It's symbolic. And again, these are tit-for-tat sanctions, but without teeth. If the CCP tries to pressure other countries into not doing business with military contractors as well, it's likely the United States will respond with even tougher sanctions on China. So how is this going to play out? Well, the Chinese Communist Party isn't really telling anybody how it's going to play out, but in my personal analysis, I think this is what's going to happen. The Chinese Communist Party is very likely going to do these sanctions through its new digital currency. Again, it's promoting this new digital currency as an alternate currency to the US dollar globally. Right now, it's only in some places in China. They talked about the global ambitions of this. If they do this, use that new digital currency as a way to make sanctions on the US, this will be a symbolic move within China and also of other U.S. adversaries in other parts of the world, that China has a new alternate currency to the U.S. which cannot be impacted by U.S. sanctions and that can be used for sanctions against the United States. Very likely this is going to be, again, a symbolic move and also a branding move, in my analysis, for the Chinese Communist Party's new currency. Now, with the elections right around the corner and with China coming into the spotlight as the top U.S. adversary, we wanted to take a closer look at the defense policies of both Trump and Biden. To learn more about that, we've invited to speak with us James Carafano. He's director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies and vice president of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Let's jump into that now. Hey, James Carafano, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, so when it comes to defense policy between the Trump and Biden policies, we're seeing very different approaches. Trump is taking more of an economic approach when it comes to China, especially being one of the main adversaries of the U.S. He's turned to sanctions and so on, but he's also trying to build up the military. The Biden defense policy looks at more shifting the focus of the Department of Defense to focus on climate change. And there's a big push right now to really degrade the U.S. military. There's a lot of analysis saying maybe we don't need such a large standing military. There's people saying this. What would you say, based on this analysis, if someone were to say, should we shift the focus of the military more for climate change, things more useful in that regard? How would you perceive that?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of baseline things. First of all, defense is there to protect America's vital interests. And lots of things do that. Diplomats help do that. The economy helps do that. But you have to remember that many of these things aren't fungible. So for example, 3 diplomats don't make up for a division. They're kind of all things you need to make the car run, just like you need a steering wheel and brakes and tires and everything. So the defense is part of that. If you look at defense needs relative to, say, the Cold War, so we don't have the Soviet Union, but we have China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. If you add all them together globally and all those forces, that's about equivalent to the challenge of dealing with the Soviet Union. And our force is actually a fraction of what it was during the Cold War. So I think relative to what we need to deal with a rising China, rest of Russia, Iran, North Korea, we're probably a little under the mark, actually, of what we need to have.
When it comes to military capabilities, Americans, we tend to be pretty confident with the strength of our military because we've had the strongest military for a good long while now. A few factors I know that are being mentioned now, though, one is stuff, equipment getting older and the need to maintain it. It costs a lot of money to maintain it. 2 is the idea of generational gaps. We're looking now, the Chinese Communist Party, one thing they're doing, they're still behind us in a lot of regards, but in some regards they're catching up quick. One of the things they're doing is we release plans on military equipment. They go and build it.
Right.
And a lot of defense experts I've talked to, I know that they're worried about the idea that if we don't start modernizing and don't prevent them from getting our technology as well, very quickly they could be where we're at, if not further. Do you think this is a realistic concern, and how do you see this developing?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are whole new emerging fields of competition where if we can't defend ourselves, we'll be at an enormous disadvantage. Hypersonic weapons is one of them. Ironically, the United States actually developed the science and technology for hypersonic weapons, but then we didn't build them. Then the Chinese just took that science and information, and the Russians did, and they went and built it. So yeah, so definitely if we don't continue to progress forward in technology, we'll actually have something that we actually haven't had since World War II, which is a qualitative disadvantage against our enemy. The other thing is, quantity matters. You can have the world's best aircraft carrier, but it can only be in one place at a time. And Russia only has to be strong in Western Europe. China only has to be strong in the Indo-Pacific. Iran only has to be influential in the Middle East. North Korea only has to threaten Northeast Asia. If the United States is going to deal with all those issues, and if we're going to work in concert with friends and allies, because friends and allies are only going to come to our side if they think we have meaningful capabilities that make us a good ally, we have to deal globally, which means we need numbers, not just quality.
Well, that's another big part of the issue we're now facing as a country, which is we do have pretty advanced fighter jets like the F-35, F-22. We do have pretty advanced equipment, but it's so expensive, we can only afford a little bit of it, and the operational costs are so high that we can only field them for so long before, really we can't train people to fly them because training costs so much and so on. And we're dealing with adversaries that are working around these things because we make them so public. They know it. Yeah. They know the equipment they have. They can build strategies that work on, say, moving around those few assets we have. And really, they can read our public reports because we have a lot of transparency. How do you see the U.S. dealing with this?
Well, ironically, money is not really the problem that people think it is. And the expense of the military really isn't the problem we think it is. When Eisenhower was president, 50% of the federal budget went to defense to fight the Cold War. Today, defense spending is less than 1/5 of the federal budget. We spend more money on the debt. We spend more money on healthcare, Medicaid, Social Security, education, welfare. There are actually many things in the federal budget that cost a lot more than defense. So it's not even the driver of the federal budget. And during the Cold War, we spent about 7% of our gross domestic product on defense. Today, we spend about 3%. So even as a percentage of what we spend, it's not so much. So they're bigger numbers, but in terms of our historic, what we spend in defense and the size of our economy and the size of what we have to defend, they're actually pretty reasonable. And when you think too that we don't have to pay with those two. So for example, if you're in Russia or China, they don't pay a soldier a living wage like an American, right? I mean, so there's a purchase parity challenge there as well. But we still put out a quality, good-sized force. So the problem is people want to spend money on lots of things until the war starts, and then they recognize how important the military is, and it's a little late then. The idea of peace through strength, spending up front to deter your enemies from actually wanting to have a war with you, is infinitely more cost-effective. It's like people that don't want to buy insurance till after they've had a car accident.
Yeah, interesting analogy. Yeah. Well, the other thing we're seeing now is the shifting of the battlefield. I know that actually a lot of your work, you were one of the guys at the front lines talking about cybersecurity threats when it was really kind of a new topic. Now we see Trump making Space Force. Now we see talk about space warfare and next generation cyber warfare and things that really seemed pretty sci-fi until very recently. Right. How necessary do you see these? And do you see China, for example, being a real threat on that playing field?
Well, the weird thing is they're not supplanting kind of traditional military things. They're not supplanting airplanes and aircraft carriers because all these things really go together to make up military capability. So space access, operations in space are absolutely vital, as is cyber operations, undersea operations, but all these things are networked together. So the days of, we could just be a great sea power, those are long gone, or, we're a land power. The reality is it's kind of like baseball. Like the team that goes to the World Series, they have a great pitcher, catcher, fielders, they can hit, they can do everything. Today, if you want a military that can actually compete in the world, you have to be able to cyber, deal with hybrid threats. You have to be able to operate in space, on the sea, under the sea, on land. It all goes together. So creating a Space Force was really absolutely the right thing to do at the right time. All of our services have created cyber activities, which are absolutely essential. And increasingly what we're seeing is, look, a lot of the stuff that we actually compete with isn't even military, it's in the private sector. Like most of the comms around the world are actually commercial stuff. And many of the cutting edge technologies actually come out of the private sector. So it's this public-private capability that really determines whether you're an economic power, whether you're a military power. It's a very, very competitive space to be in. And the notion that somehow we can just do it all on the cheap, even though it's really actually not that expensive relative to everything we spend money on, but the notion that somehow we can defend America's global interests on the cheap is just incredibly unrealistic and very dangerous.
Hey, James Carafano, it's great having you on Crossroads.
Thanks for having me.
Now, folks, again, we recently showed the documentary film Finding Courage on our channel. It was only available through the weekend due to distribution rights. But for anyone looking to support the filmmakers or who wants to see that movie, it's available on the findingcouragemovie.com website. And for those of you interested, you can use the promo code Crossroads to receive a 25% off deal for the full bundle that includes the movie, book, soundtrack, and behind-the-scenes footage. Also, the live Q&A I did with the film's director, Kay Rubacek, is still up. So if you missed that, be sure to check that out as well. Now, I have the link to the Finding Courage website in the description below. And again, you can use the promo code Crossroads. Now, that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also on Sundays, I do a live Q&A, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you want to support this channel also, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below this video. If you haven't already also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us grow. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can tell a friend or family member about Crossroads and share this video with them. Now, that said, folks, please stay informed and stay free.